Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this Nobles Graduate Author Talk. My name is Talia Sokol, and I am one of the co-directors of the Putnam Library. I'm also the Gender and Sexuality Specialist at Nobles, and I'm so excited that we're here tonight with Sasha Geffen from the class of 2007. Sasha is the author of Glitter Up the Dark, How Pop Music Broke the Binary, which was published last year by the University of Texas Press. At Nobles, Sasha was on the Noblemen, served as a student leader of the Gay Straight Alliance, and acted in and directed Nobles Theater Collective productions. They graduated from Nobles in 2007 and went on to the University of Chicago. Sasha's writing can also be found in Artforum, The Nation, Vulture, Pitchfork, The Chicago Reader, as well as other publications. Originally from Boston, they now live in Denver, where they teach at the Lighthouse Writers Workshop. So let's give a warm welcome to Sasha. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much
Uh,
for having me.
so I have like a bunch of questions for you, and I hope that you'll just like sort of give us your thoughts about, sort of like lots of things related to this amazing book, which I have here. It is so good. I finished it a couple days ago. Highly recommend it to everyone to read. So would you tell us a little bit like about the book, as well as maybe just your career in music writing, and sort of how you got the inspiration specifically to write this book?
Yeah, totally. I think the genesis for the book kind of came out of a lot of writing that I was doing anyway, that I was sort of like naturally gravitating towards in the past like 5 or 6 years. Um, I was thinking a lot about the overlap between pop music and gender and the way that gendered ideas could kind of be communicated subliminally through music, even when like artists weren't explicitly communicating their gender identity or like before they came out, or kind of more explicitly talked about how they identified. I was fascinated by that. It just seemed like more and more of my favorite artists were like coming out as trans or queer or non-binary, and I wanted to dig down into the roots of that phenomenon of like why music in particular is such fertile ground for exploring these ideas and how these ideas can be explored, kind of metatextually without really talking about them explicitly. So around, I think it was like 2018, Jessica Hopper, who's also like a music writer and author, who I'd worked with previously at Pitchfork and MTV News, she invited me to pitch a book for a new series that she was, or a series that she was new to at the University of Texas Press, their American music series. And I just kind of scrounged up a lot of thoughts that I already had been stewing on, and got them together into a proposal, and then got the chance to really do like a historical deeper dive on some of these ideas. And like, I guess what surprised me was like, I thought that maybe I would have to stretch things a little bit to really, map this contemporary thesis onto the past like 60, 70 years of music. I found that that was not the case at all. Like the more I dug, the more I found that kind of supported this idea that music and gender transgression are very, very closely bound. And their roots are very deeply intertwined in a lot of ways and a lot of different parts of the world and in different times. So that was kind of delightful to explore at length.
Yeah, that is really cool. That like I'm thinking about that now because right, you're talking about something that I think people think is like this really contemporary topic, but really it's not this contemporary topic. It's something that's been around for a really long time, and it's something that you don't have to sort of like put onto history. It's already like richly present within history, I think, in this really interesting way. So could you talk a little bit more sort of about like how you did the research? Like how did you pick the bands or the musicians that you were going to write about? Obviously, as a librarian, I'm fascinated by the research project process. And in your, I think maybe in your acknowledgments or in your notes, you talk about like going to libraries and so, or finding information online. So how did that process work?
Yeah, I think a lot of the book was made possible, by the work of like really tireless internet archivists who, um, do their work largely without pay or acclaim or like anything other than personal satisfaction in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of like live footage that gets uploaded to YouTube. There are a lot of databases online of like old music magazines. People like painstakingly transcribe old magazines or scan them, like a lot of fan archives in that work, which is really fun to dive into. Like it's fun to see these like hubs that people put on the internet for their favorite bands, you know, even if there's not a lot of new music coming out, those like fandoms are really, really enduring, and the work that
Yeah.
people kind of go to make sure that their legacies are remembered is really awesome. But I also relied on a lot of books that came out before mine. I think, you know, it's kind of a common refrain that like books are made of books, right? And to write one book, you have to read like dozens of others. Um, so there was a lot of thought that I was building on, like Wayne Kostenbaum's book, The Queen's Throat, was a big guide for mine. Francesca T. Royster's Sounding Like a No-No also like explored a lot of these same ideas or similar ideas, just the tie between gender and music. So I guess like when it came to the selection process, because there's obviously so much, there's so many bands and artists that, you know, could be explored through this lens, but I think the defining factor was probably my own personal history and like personal taste. Like I think I tend to conclude chapters with artists that are like very dear to me, whether, you know, it's like Against Me or Placebo, or like a lot of bands that I listened to in high school earlier when I was like quite young and growing up, that I think were speaking to me on a level that I wasn't really ready to acknowledge yet, or didn't have the language for. I guess this was just like a process of giving the language to those memories. So that was kind of the defining factor, was like, I don't know, as much as I learned about music that I didn't necessarily, you know, deeply historically resonate with, that was kind of like that. My love of these bands was kind of what guided me through the selection.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, I think I was going to ask you this later, but I'm going to ask you it now. Like, what were some of the bands that really meant a lot to you when you were in high school? Because I can remember growing up, like I'm a little bit older than you. I graduated high school in 2003. I can remember listening to like all of the sort of like early 2000s pop punk and emo, and just how much that meant to me at the time, and still to some degree, but like really just like the lyrics and just like the meaning behind the music was just so profound to like, 15-year-old me. I'm just wondering like what were some of the musicians and the bands that you listened to in like middle school and high school that like were really meaningful for you?
Totally. I also a lot of punk and pop punk. I think like Green Day and like the Buzzcocks and those yelpy, um, frenetic, you know, 2-minute songs, like really tightly wound. That's like a very good good high school soundtrack, I think. In middle school, so anyone who knew me then will tell you that I was obsessed with Savage Garden to like kind of a pathological degree, like in that it was like my only defining feature in 7th grade. It was like the only thing I knew how to talk about. Um, Also, I think just like they made it into the book because looking back, there was like a really strong identification with that voice, right? Like that like androgyny of voice. That was kind of my first real fandom. Shifted through like some indie rock of the era. Like I was really into Bright Eyes and Neutral Milk Hotel, and like Iron and Wine and other bands. But not that all of those are necessarily like gender breaking artists, but I think there was something about like men singing badly that probably spoke to me in some way. This like kind of like breakage or failure of masculinity there.
Like Neutral Milk Hotel, that's like how you could define Neutral Milk Hotel, right? Men singing badly. I love
Yeah, just one dude with like a really big diaphragm was kind of going for it.
that's so funny. Um, So thinking about then like your high school self, how did your time at Nobles, like how did that influence your work, your writing? Were there any teachers or classes that were particularly impactful for you as a writer?
Totally. I think I actually wrote my first ever album review in 8th grade English class for a homework assignment. Bill Buzzy told us all to go home and pick an album and write about it. And I picked Alanis Morissette's Under Rug Swept and wrote maybe like 600 words on that. And so I think that probably planted a seed at some point. But I don't know. I definitely learned to write at Nobles. Like I had a couple of Richard Baker's classes, and it's still like strange kind of referring to everyone by their full names as opposed to like Mr. Baker, Mr. Buzzy. Tim Carey was also my 7th grade English teacher, and Vicky Seelan I had in my senior year. All teachers who encouraged me to kind of like dig deeper into what I was already probably inclined towards, like you're interested in music, you're interested in language, like go have fun. I think like on the line level, those Baker English classes did a lot for me because he's just so detail oriented when it comes to grading papers, and just like I really got an excellent sense of how language worked kind of as a machine, like how the economics of language could produce like an effect in a reader. And we read really great stuff in those classes too, that I think, just opened my eyes to what language could do. I think I very briefly make reference to Willa Cather in the Prince chapter of the book, and that was her My Antonia,
That's
is one that I read in my junior year English class.
that's awesome. So we have a lot of kids now who are like current students who love to write. We have a writing club, a creative writing club. We have creative writing classes. We have an independent novel class that kids can take that's, taught by Gia Batty, which like just really a lot of encouragement for kids to write. Do you have any advice for kids who are aspiring writers, who want to maybe someday grow up and be just like you?
Oh gosh. Sure. I would say that whatever that like you should read as much as you can get your hands on, but also kind of like trust where your intuition is guiding you when it comes to the kind of stuff that really lights you up. I think it can be hard, when you're in school and there's all these things that you like have to read. There can be maybe a little bit of friction with like thinking of reading as homework. And I think it's really important to like chase down what lights you up inside, like when you're reading, like what just kind of like blows your mind or expands you, whether that's like poetry, whether that's nonfiction, whether that's fiction, or all of the above. And I do think all these genres can feed each other. I think that like if you're an aspiring novelist, like reading poetry can be really helpful. If you want to be a journalist, reading fiction can be really helpful. But yeah, definitely trusting that kind of like somatic reaction to whatever you happen to be reading, and just finding ways to generate more of that, to like look for more of what causes you to feel that way is really important.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that'll resonate with our community. So I have some questions also. I'd love to hear like more specifically about like the stuff about the connections to music and gender. And so I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask. First off is sort of what do you see as the contemporary role of like musicians and pop music, maybe specifically in raising awareness, support, like etc., for the trans and non-binary community, right? I mean, you're talking about breaking down the binary, and how pop music can do that. And so what do you think sort of the contemporary role is now for musicians? Like, is there an obligation to do that? Like, how do you see that playing out in today's world?
I think if you're communicating honestly in some way, on some level, obviously there's a lot of artifice in pop music, but if there is kind of like an honest thread in that performance, it will reach the people it needs to. I don't know if it needs to, if there's like a specific obligation towards like activism as a genre. Um, but I think most good music, does challenge conventional ways of thinking, because a lot of what's conventional about our culture is not very conducive to the arts kind of in general, or to ways of expression, beyond a very limited view, there's like a very narrow aperture of like how things are supposed to be and how people are supposed to behave. Um, and of course there are like constant digressions from that, but I think like it's, for art to be compelling in general, it does have to push past that in some way. It has to challenge people in some way. Like there are plenty of like nostalgia acts or music that's kind of made to sustain the status quo in some way, and it doesn't mean that it's bad to like anything um, that does that. But I think just for me, the most exciting music being made, the most exciting performers that I see right now are kind of like bristling a little bit at
Yeah.
the walls that they're in,
Yeah.
which is really great to see. But I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily think of that as like raising awareness in general. I think maybe there's a way to like raise awareness for the people who need their own awareness, right? It's like just,
Yeah.
you know, if you see like a queer musician performing like really openly on a stage or on TV, and that kind of like brings you to a higher level of vibration when it comes to like feeling at home in your own body, or like figuring out kind of like how you want to exist in the world, like that can be really powerful. And that's something that I've experienced personally kind of over and over again,
Yeah.
as someone who's been like a lifelong fan of music. I think that's probably the most important piece of like, I don't know, bringing
Yeah.
awareness to people.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. And it's interesting because I think like part of it is like redefining maybe what our perception of pop music is, right? Because I think there's this narrow definition in a lot of people's minds of like what pop music is, but like really it's so much broader than like, in my head, I think, oh, pop music is like Britney Spears. And then but there's obviously like so much more than that. And so I think that's a really interesting point. So I guess I wonder like for all of the music out there that like does do all of this sort of breaking down of binaries and making people feel seen and sort of like expanding our understandings, and like awareness of gender, why do you think that like music allows for this expansiveness and maybe to some degree like subversiveness, like when it comes to breaking down the gender binary, perhaps like more than like other forms of art, right? Like when I think of like how, for example, like the medium of television has like portrayed trans and non-binary people up until recently, it's either like not at all or like really, really badly. And so I wonder like why if you have like sort of an idea of maybe why you think music is like, I don't know if it's the exception or why it's able to do this in a way that perhaps other mediums aren't able to do this.
I think it's probably because music performance is more subtle and dreamlike and less explicit than a lot of other media, that people can kind of get away with doing things that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Like if you think back to, I don't know, sitcoms in the 70s, like you wouldn't see a character dressed like David Bowie probably, um, just because storytelling that kind of aims to cement what's already there, or to satisfy certain conventions of narrative, will always, or will generally be kind of like pinned back a little bit in ways that maybe music isn't. Like there's not necessarily an explicit narrative when you go to see a concert. It's a little bit more open. You're not always sure what's going on, and it's also like very fleeting in a way. It kind of like runs through you like water. So I think there's an opportunity to enjoy a little bit more risk there. I also think that like singing as a communicative art is different from speaking,
Mhm.
and kind of flips us into maybe a more, I don't know, heightened or open or softer mode than like hearing words spoken. I
Yeah.
think just like on a very like fundamental, like human level, like singing is its own thing. And it allows for storytelling that is not super beholden to the conventions of narrative and kind of conventions more broadly.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? And also I feel like at least with like music up maybe up until recently, maybe with like the invention of, you know, MTV, you couldn't necessarily see who the musician was, right? You could just sort of imagine what they looked like, and that necessarily didn't have to be connected to a gender, unlike where if you're seeing it like on television or something. I don't know, like it's an interesting thing to think about because like we know perhaps more now than we did then, and I wonder how that like impacts sort of how we perceive music. So I'm like wondering also, like I guess today, who you think is doing particularly cool stuff in music, who you listen to, like artists that you would recommend, especially for people looking to kind of go outside the box of what they might think of like traditionally in pop music.
Totally. There's an artist called Lucy Liu, that's like Liyou, who does really cool kind of ambient experimental um, work that makes really heavy use of text to speech as kind of like the second voice in the work. And their music has like really intense meditations on gender kind of scattered throughout. I think also Colin Self is someone whose their last album came out a couple of years ago, but it's also really ecstatic and kind of like zigzagging through a lot of these ideas. Yves Tumor, also someone who is just like confounding in the best way. Really challenging performance style, really cool videos. Like an artist who always kind of looks different from video to video, has that kind of like chameleonic presence. And there was a new Serpent with Feet album that came out this year also. That is one of my favorite albums of the year. And his falsetto and his vocal layering and the way he does like vocal characters is really beautiful. I think I could go on, but there's four, I think.
That's awesome. Um, so thinking about like, okay, obviously there's like a lot of threads in the book, and there's your, you know, there's the love of music, and there's talking about music, but also just listening to you talk and reading the book. There's also like the celebration of, you know, trans and non-binary people in a way that I feel like I don't see that necessarily in a lot of spaces, which is super rad, right? Like to do that in your book and to see that like present. So I guess like what messages would you want to send to like our students, to our community members, especially those of our like our community who are trans, who are non-binary, genderqueer, like about, you know, like themselves, right? I feel like we see so many things in, it's kind of like it's a hard question to like put into words, but like we see so many negative sort of portrayals or conversations in the media, in the news about like trans identity and about, you know, how, you know, things that we see, but really like we should be celebrating, right? Like I feel like to be a part of a community that's so special and so awesome is like a really wonderful thing, and with all the challenges also come like a lot of really amazing things. So like I wonder if you have any sort of words of encouragement or like thoughts about that, especially to like say to our students, our community members, who are trans, who are non-binary, who are genderqueer, like, you know, who may be listening or perhaps might listen to this in the future once it's on YouTube.
Yeah, for sure. I think as hard as it can be to live in the world in this way and to have to like figure out embodiment and like sociality in this kind of different way for most people, the perspective that you get from not quite fitting the dominant, you know, mode of existing is really valuable and can be really valuable. Like you get this opportunity to perceive things slightly askew from a lot of other people, and that can help illuminate, you know, a lot of things that need to be illuminated. Like I think the struggle for, you know, gender parity and like trans liberation, like that's bound up in a lot of other struggles I think, gender liberation and Black and Brown and Indigenous liberation are all bound to each other. And, obviously there's tons of people at like the various intersections of all those identities. And I think that, not just kind of running the scripts that power insists that you run, and glitching that system a little bit can give you a really powerful tool to try to make life livable for people, to like open up more space so that we all can exist, and continue to like make things in the future and like make a future. I think
Yeah.
that's like, I don't know, it's a powerful place to be, as difficult as it is. Like it's a great opportunity. And I think just like, I think it's hard when you are just kind of starting to figure this stuff out, but the ways that you will find to connect with other people, other trans, non-binary, queer people, like the opportunities for community making that this outsiderness brings is just valuable beyond words. It is magic.
Yeah.
There's
Magic.
a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, it's glittery. And yeah, I guess there's something really powerful, especially about the way that like youth intersects with that, I think. Thinking about, all that I've learned from young people, right, when it comes to talking about gender, when it comes to talking about queerness, and sort of the path that they're leading for like everybody else, I think is like really profound. Do you see any way that like youth connects to some of the stuff that you talk about in the book, right? Like there's a lot of groups that you talk about that are like beloved by teens, right? And you talk about how you did research and you found, the fan archives. And I think a lot of it, I would imagine, comes from young people who have this almost like obsessive, you know, understanding and love for a musician or for a band, right? I think about the way that people like are today obsessed with like a band like BTS, right? And how that's like teens like leading the way on that. Could you talk a little bit sort of about the intersection maybe that you see between like the youth culture of, and like maybe the not, I don't, obsession sounds like a bad thing, but I don't think it is a bad thing, with music, and perhaps like where it intersects with this like breaking down of the binary and sort of deconstruction of gender. Sorry, that was a lot
Yeah,
that I just asked.
no, you're fine. So the book kind of starts around the same time that like the teen as an identity figure and as like a consumer category really started to take shape in the 50s. And that cultural figure was kind of the result of a lot of, surplus income among young people. This like post-war phenomenon of like very young people, like people still in high school, like having money to spend on records. And so with a band like the Beatles, you see this kind of first massive wave, not the first wave overall, but the first kind of like global, massive, like mass cultural wave of love for a singular music product, right? And a lot of that love was among teen girls. Like the reason the Beatles were as commercially and artistically successful as they were was because they tapped into this burgeoning market of teenage girls. So like you don't really get the next like 50, 60 years of music history without that dynamic of like very young but adult performers, and then even younger fans who are historically largely girls. And I don't know, I think that when you are in your teens, you have a lot of passion and excitement and enthusiasm, um, and also a lot of pain and confusion. And you kind of need something to pin that on, to like figure out what is happening in the world. Like, I'm feeling all these things, like there must be like some model or some example out there that can speak to that. And I think pop music is really good at doing that, like even just like the way someone sings like a specific word, you can kind of like suck up for yourself and be like, yes, exactly, that's exactly how I'm feeling.
Right.
And I think that like transposing of feeling onto the external can like cross gender boundaries. Like you can,
Yeah.
you know, identify so vividly with someone who doesn't share a gender identity with you. Um, and you can also use that contrast or that similarity to kind of like figure out your own place in the world, whether that's, you know, whatever kind of like gendered existence you have. I think it's kind of a sounding ground to figure that out.
Yeah. No, that the intersection of like the passion and the pain of being a teenager, and how for me that manifested in an obsession with Dashboard Confessional, which is really bad.
Nice. Excellent.
Which if everyone should listen. So great. No. So yeah, I mean, is those are basically like the questions that I wanted to ask you. And so I'm just like, is there anything else you wanted to share, you know, with the community about writing, about music, about like anything like with the book? Is there any sort of any messages you want to leave us with?
I don't know. I guess if you have like an idea that seems far-fetched and you're very young and you think like maybe I want to be like a music journalist or music critic someday, it's better not to let that go. I don't want to be just like follow your dreams. I mean, yes, we should all follow our dreams, but I think like, I don't know, the weirdness in you, the particularities that you haven't quite figured out how to sit with yet, those are actually going to be your strength and
Yeah,
your power, most likely.
yeah, that's
Or at
really,
least they were for me.
that's awesome.
Um,
Actually, it's a really good message, right? It's like I'm going to quote a musical now, which is that
please.
in Shrek the musical, they say, what makes you special makes you strong. And I feel like that is sort of like the message, right? That like these things that make us different, these things that make us unique are the things that we can like take out into the world and like use to like live our lives like in like the fullest and most awesomest glittery way.
Totally. And like, even if it's like really hard,
Yeah.
right? I think that's kind of a big piece of it. It's like
Yeah.
the years that you spend like figuring out how to carry these hard things will help in some way. Um,
Yeah.
Hopefully help in a way that kind of like it gets you closer to like peace and acceptance and all that good stuff. It's kind of, I think it's hard to imagine that line, you know, from
Yeah.
like, you know, things that are causing me pain to like things that will eventually like cause me great satisfaction.
Right.
But it can happen.
Yeah, it does happen. And thank you so much. So glad that you did this with us, and hope you all, everyone watching at home, has a wonderful rest of your evening. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, Talia.